So today I'm going to talk about the topic related to engineering. So I'm going to talk about biomaterials for voice reconstruction and try to explain some of the challenges in the selection of biomaterials for vocal fold reconstruction. Just get things started here. Okay, so just to start things off, some of you might have seen recently in the Journal of New England Medicine a report on one of the first implantations of prostheses, a total laryngeal replacement, basically. So the prosthesis was implanted in the patient, and it was a two-step surgical operation, but following that, the patient could use the prosthesis. You could eat normally. The food was going down in the stomach the way it was supposed to. He was able to breathe for long periods of time without using his stomach. It was a total laryngectomy patient. And importantly, he was able to recover some voice. So his voice was not perfect. I think that it was 20% on some speech articulation scale, but at least there was some recovery. He also recovered taste, which for a French, this was done in Toulouse, and you know how the French love food, so I think it's very important for him. And watching the video that accompanies the article is very telling and interesting. So obviously, we're putting materials into the human body. And so there's an entire science of biomaterials that is exploding right now with a lot of progress being made in all kinds of different novel materials. And in engineering, we're used to material design using, for example, this is an Ashby plot. An Ashby plot is used in mechanical engineering to do first cut selection of a material for a given application. So it's a chart that shows basically how strong a material is as a function of its toughness. So if you look at glasses, for example, these are pretty stiff materials, but they break very easily, so they cannot deform or stretch very much. And metals are both strong and tough. They can deform elastically for pretty large deformations, and they remain very strong. And if you look at materials that are softer for soft tissue implantation, well, these are obviously less strong, but they do have to undergo large deformation. So you're looking for materials that are tougher. And so for organs such as the vocal fold and soft materials that are tough is basically what you want. And we are all familiar somewhat with the anatomy of the larynx and the topology of the vocal fold, and we know that it's a complicated organ. Because of the fact that it's a layered structure, the mechanical properties of the vocal folds are different along different directions. So when you stretch them along the anterior-posterior direction, they're stiffer than when you try to stretch them in the lateral direction, for example. And the composition of the vocal fold includes a lot of water. It includes a lot of fibers that tend to be aligned in the anterior-posterior direction. And it's a composite of many different substances that are interspersed between the epithelium, the different layers of the lamina propria, from the superficial going deep into the muscle, which is stiffer and actuates the organ. So it is a complicated organ. Now the field of biomaterial for vocal fold repairs is fairly active. So this is the result of a literature survey where I put some keywords. So I put the keywords biomaterials, grafts, implants, and injectable materials together with the word vocal folds, and used ISI Web of Knowledge to pull out basically all of the contributions, the journal articles, the conference presentations and patents and so forth. And so this pulls out basically those who have contributed in the field. So Xin-Xiao Jia is at the University of Delaware. Many of you know Susan Thibault at the University of Wisconsin. And of course, Steve Zeitels at Mass General. And you see other people like Professor Irano in Tokyo. And of course, our host, Bob Saitaloff, has also made contributions in the field. And we're just beginning in my research work. These are two former and current graduate students who are trying to make some contributions in the field. Now, as part of this analysis, you can interestingly look at all the different fields involved in biomaterials for vocal fold reconstruction. And the basic idea is that going from chemistry to cell biology, to laryngology, to pediatrics, this area is very multidisciplinary. I obviously don't know everything in all of these fields, and so anybody working in biomaterials, it's a very humbling experience because there's no way we can possibly know all of the aspects of every field involved. If we look at the number of publications and the number of contributions over the year, we see that the field is progressively growing, and it's a very active area of research. What happens when we put something in the human body? Well, obviously, the human body doesn't want it there. And so the first thing that happens is an immune response. And so through, there are various stages of an inflammation, followed by infection, followed by coagulation, and ultimately fibrosis that takes place. And this immune response is normal and healthy, but that is what we have to fight against. And it plays an important role in the type of material that we're going to select to try to avoid basically rejection by the body, elimination, and the body to flush it out down the lymphatic system. So in many engineering applications, the problem of material selection is relatively straightforward. So we're looking at, is this material going to do the job? Is it going to be stiff enough? Is it going to be solid enough and have the right mechanical properties? But when we look at biomaterials, the number of material design requirements becomes much larger, and so material design becomes something very, very challenging with all kinds of aspects. So first of all, we're looking at the form of material we want to use. So for soft tissues, oftentimes this will be hydrogels, and we can have particles to functionalize the gel, embed other substances that we can release using various forms of activation. We also should look at material selection. So there's a wide range of natural or synthetic materials that are available. We should look at the way the material is delivered, whether it's through a laryngoscope, whether it's going to be an injection, or if it has to be delivered through a vehicle like a particle or some kind of vessel that will degrade over time and release a substance later on. Obviously, we need to look at the mechanical properties and the microstructure of the material to try to emulate as much as possible the structure of the organ that we're trying to replace. And we need to look at the degradation of the material over time. So we don't want the material to degrade too quickly. At the same time, we don't want the material to stay there all the time because that is potentially a source of increased risk for cancer. And so we need the degradation to occur over a time period that's just right. In terms of chemistry, one of the challenges of many soft materials is that they're not really very sticky, and sometimes you do want good cell adhesion, so you have to work on the chemistry to add substances that will make the material more sticky. You also could embed additional therapeutics like growth factors or microvesicles or different drugs that will help prevent the immune response from eliminating the body and degrading it too quickly. And finally, we need to think about manufacturing aspects. Essentially, is it possible to really make the processes? Is it cost efficient? Is the cost reasonable? And also, one of the challenges is the availability of raw materials and the consistency of the material that we get from different suppliers. Sometimes these materials are quite expensive, and when you get it from different suppliers, they're not really the same, so they have varying properties, and it causes a lot of variability in the results. So the holy grail will be a material that includes all of these different characteristics. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about each of these aspects, basically, one after the other, and try to explain a little bit some of the work that we're doing to address emerging questions and emerging needs in vocal fold implants. So in terms of form of the materials, for soft tissue replacement, a lot of the processes that we use are made of hydrogels. So hydrogels are materials that contain a lot of water, and so they have way over 90% basically water content. They have been around for a while, since the 1950s. They can absorb up to 1,000 times the weight of the solid phase of the material in terms of water. And it's material that's right in between a solid and a liquid. It's kind of like a gel. So you can have it in liquid form, you can make it solidify through a process that we call cross-linking, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And the mechanical, one aspect of the material that's interesting is it's got a mechanical response similar to that of the extracellular matrix, which is basically the material that makes up the lamina propria for the vocal folds. And it has reduced risks of inflammation. So the advantages of hydrogels are that they're biocompatible, they're injectable through a needle, and they can be made smart in that we can make them to cross-link based on changes in the pH of the environment or changes in temperature. So if you heat or cool a material, it can become stiffer or softer. It can go from liquid to solid with changes of temperature, or light exposure, like when you go to the dentist and they put the UV light to cross-link the material and make it gelify. But it also has some challenges, and one of the challenges is that it has poor adhesion. It is difficult to sterilize without changing its physical properties. Some of them are pretty expensive. Cross-linking is not easy in some cases. And they are very soft, but this is not really a disadvantage. It's actually good for vocal folds because that organ is actually very soft. So we can use the hydrogels to our advantage. Very briefly, you can classify hydrogels based on their electrical charges. So they have the potential to have electrical potentials that can drive fluid in and out of the material in a way similar to tissue. I'll talk some more about that. You can classify them according to their structure or the porosity of their networks. So most of them are very porous, with very big water-filled pores, but some of them have reduced pore sizes. The gelation can be achieved either using physical cross-link with very weak ionic bond between the molecules, or using chemical cross-linkers where these chemicals, which are in generally toxic, will create stronger covalent bonds between the molecules and turn basically the liquid into a solid gel. You can also achieve gelation, or the transition between liquid and solid phase, using a stimuli response, for example, a change in pH, or different types of light excitations, ultraviolet or infrared light. you can make these materials in composite forms. You can add fibers, you can add particles, and you can also do a dual network where you can have a pretty coarse, broad network that has a certain role, for example, to maintain the structure and maintain the toughness of the organ, and embed a secondary network that is finer grained to promote cell migration, for example, or to have a role at a smaller scale on smaller aspects of the implant. And so these composite networks can be achieved and can be fabricated in different ways. So one example of composite network that we're looking into is to embed carbon nanotubes inside hydrogels. So for those of you who are not familiar with nanotechnology, carbon nanotubes are very small, 15 nanometer in diameter, carbon structures that are very regular, and they form essentially long, regular, very uniform diameter tubes. And they can be grown using chemical processes. And you can also embed different carbon nanotubes of different diameter to form multi-walled carbon nanotubes. And these are bigger in diameter. They are 200 or 300 nanometer in diameter. So just about the same diameter as collagen fibers in the extracellular matrix. Now, one thing that's interesting about carbon nanotube is that they respond to electrical stimulation by stretching. So multi-walled nanotubes can be construed as actuators, and if you put an electrical current through them, they're going to deform. So it is used in biomechanics for different applications, for example, for pacemaking, where you can use it as a sensor or an actuator that will translate essentially the neural currents into mechanical excitation and mechanical forces. Now, as you might imagine, since it's a carbonous structure, the first thing that people are worried about is whether or not it's biocompatible and biodegradable in the human body. We are in our lab, we're testing the cell viability, so we're putting vocal fold fibroblasts inside solutions of carbon nanotubes to see how the cells react. And we also characterize the influence of the carbon nanotube inside the material on its degradability, its porosity, and how difficult it is to inject, essentially the gelation time of the material, as well as its piezoresistivity. And as you might be able to see, if you take a quick look at the figure here, you can see that cell viability is not really that bad. So we're able to achieve 85% cell viability over 7 days for fibroblast cells immersed in a solution with CNTs for reasonable concentrations of CNTs. So with viability, of course, there's always an issue of what is the concentration. So above a certain concentration, cell viability becomes a problem, but reduced cell concentrations or reduced CNT concentrations, cell viability is not too bad. One thing that's interesting is that the presence of the CNTs, as for the presence of fibers similar to collagen inside the gel, changes the porosity, changes the pore size. You want pores to be big enough for the cells to walk through, so they have to be big enough than the cell size, which is around 50 microns, roughly. But you don't want the pores to be too big either, because otherwise it could be a challenge for cell adhesion. And therefore, the pore size affects cell migration. So one of the things we do is we put cells with staining agents, and then we take long-term microscopy pictures to see whether or not the gel is able to recruit cells inside the biomaterials, and to see whether or not we have good migration of the cells if they find adhesion points and they're able to move through the gels. This is important. Basically, you want the cells to be able to move, to be able to reproduce and to stay viable. in the organ. Now, what would be the application? Well, we're thinking that the incorporation of prostheses with carbon nanotubes within the larynx could potentially make the organ electrically conductive. So for paralysis, for example, a device is being introduced called the laryngeal pacemaker, which essentially tries to put an electrical current in the laryngeal nerve to try to restore a little bit of vocal function. And you could think that with carbon nanotubes, it would be possible to add an actuation component to this and actually make the vocal fold vibrate externally. So such a tool in the hands of voice scientists like Ron Scherer or Johan Sundberg would be a great thing, because they could dial the voice and make it sound nice for us. With the drawback that, of course, in bad hands, this could potentially turn against us. Now, to talk about material selection, injectable hydrogels are biocompatible, biodegradable, and so they have very low toxicity, and they're very porous, which helps the transfer of nutrients and gases. They allow cell encapsulation, so it's easy to encapsulate cell in the gel before injection. And they can be cross-linked in a number of different ways. And you always have an option of going with natural or synthetic materials. So natural hydrogels are preferred most of the time because they are natural, so the potential for rejection are reduced. They tend to be more biocompatible. And natural materials come from mammals or from plants, so they tend to be easier and more biocompatible than synthetic materials. So they're mostly polypeptides or polysaccharide. They have a chemistry that's similar to the chemistry of the extracellular matrix of the Lamina Propria. And you obtain them from the degradation of natural polymers. Now, there's always a risk of immune response even with natural hydrogels. And one of the problems is batch-to-batch variability. So when you buy these products, if you don't buy a big batch where you have enough in your lab for a lifetime, and you have to buy from different suppliers at different times, there's usually a lot of variability between products, which poses problems for engineering applications anyway. So the natural injectable hydrogels, those that are most commonly used include collagen, gelatin, elastin, and fibrin, as well as alginate, chitosan, and hyaluronic acid. Hyaluronic acid is very well known. Actually, it is part of commercially available injectable products for the folds. But one problem with HA is that it tends to degrade very quickly and to be flushed away relatively soon. And so it requires increased amounts of cross-linker to basically resist enzymatic degradation. And that increased amount of cross-linker tends to hamper cell migration. If you look at the literature, if you look at the program of any conference on biomaterials, these days there are millions of materials, literally, that are being considered everywhere. There are hundreds and hundreds of different materials, different variations of HA or chitosan, with some small chemical modifications or functionalization and so on. So how do we select the best material? So in engineering, we have a tool called the decision matrix, which is a way in engineering design where you take essentially the design variables and you put the list of all the different materials that you would want to consider. So CS is for chitosan, AG is for alginate, and HA is for hyaluronic acid. And then we just basically, from the literature, for high and low concentrations of cross-linker, you try to put a number on for each aspect of your material, how good the material is going to be. And then you just calculate a composite score, and that allows you to basically rank the material and try to determine which one is the best for your application. And this has to be done periodically, so the numbers in the table here date back from 2010, when we started to get into this field. If we were going to do it again today, probably that the classification of the materials would already be quite different because of what we've learned about certain materials. And one of the biggest changes that we've made in recent years is to go from hyaluronic acid to chitosan, and I'll explain it a little bit more. Chitosan is a good material because it's mechanically strong and very robust, and it doesn't degrade very quickly in the human body. It's very biocompatible. It's made out of the shell of many crustaceans like crabs or lobsters, and it's very appealing. It's easy to encapsulate particles or fibers for drug delivery. One disadvantage of chitosan is it's very messy to work with because it's not soluble in water in its original form. So a modified form of chitosan is called glycol chitosan. And glycol chitosan makes it soluble over the entire pH range. So you don't need a very acidic solution to be able to dissolve the chitosan into a solution. So glycol chitosan has good swelling properties, good drug delivery properties, and it can be mixed with collagen to increase pore size and enhance cell adhesion. And I'll talk more about the mixing with collagen in just a second. For cross-linking glycochitosan, the chemical that we use is glyoxal, and the benefit of glyoxal is that the byproducts of the degradation of glycochitosan cross-linked with glyoxal are non-toxic, and that is a big advantage in terms of biocompatibility. Now, when we put a gel in the body, what we want essentially is the cells to be able to migrate and to adhere and to migrate through the material so that they can proliferate and they can lay essentially new extracellular matrix and start the regeneration process. So cell migration is important, and as in Spider-Man, you need something to grab on to be able to migrate through the material. So embedding fibers is a good idea, and so this cartoon basically shows how cells, you see the cell with the nucleus, will essentially extend some lobopodial extensions, will grab fibers, and there will be focal adhesion points that you use to basically pull themselves through the material. And so the role of fibers inside the gel is illustrated here, where we have in a solution with cells, we have imaged the F-actin, which is a protein that is here shown in green. It's fluorescent. And it's essentially gives you a picture of all the binding sites and the adhesion between the cells and the substrate. So when you have lots of them and you see them really spread out, that means that the cells are really adhering to the substrate, and that is good for cell migration. So the fibers that are most naturally, occurring in the ECM are collagen, and so it makes sense to use collagen embedded in the gel to try to, promote cell migration. And collagen 1 is widely found in different organs, including the vocal folds, and it's used a lot for wound dressing and dermal filling. So collagen 1 is well known and used a lot in tissue engineering. Now, what's less used is collagen 3. So the composition of collagen 3 is slightly different. So you have 3 alpha-1 chains instead of 2 alpha-1 and 1 alpha-2 chain. So it's a slight microstructural difference. As a result, collagen 3 is a lot softer than collagen 1. And if you look at SCAR has a lot of collagen 1 that excess collagen 1 essentially, and SCAR is very stiff. But the presence of collagen 3 usually helps to prevent scar formation, and collagen 3 is a lot softer. And so we think that the use of collagen-3 is probably better than collagen-1 in terms of avoiding scar formation and obtaining the right stiffness properties of the organ. If you look at how stiff an organ is as a function of the ratio of collagen-3 over collagen-1, you can see that as the relative amount of collagen-3 increases, the organs tend to be softer and more stretchable. So if you look at the vocal folds, which has a relatively large amount of collagen-3, or the liver, which are these are organs that stretch a lot, they tend to have higher collagen-3 content than, for example, the heart or the lungs. And so what we're doing is we're creating heterotypic fibers where we can actually mix type 1 and type 3 collagen. And the human body does that as well. So you will find heterotypic collagen 1 and 3 fibers in the human body, but we can do it chemically as well. So that our fibers have a little bit of the properties of collagen 1 and collagen 3. So that is the optimal, and we did collagen 1, collagen 3, and different mixtures of the two. We tested the mechanical properties and so on and so forth before finding that the 50-50 combination is probably ideal. And so our material is called Chico for chitosan collagen. It essentially takes glycochitosan with glycosyl cross-linker, and you embed heterotypical collagen 1 and 3 fibers to form a hybrid scaffold. And that's an injectable material for scar treatment. This is the work of Neda Latifi, who is finishing up her PhD in my lab. She's the one who came up with that idea. And she has done a whole battery of tests, which I don't have time to really report everything here, but all of the characterization of this material in terms of cytotoxicity, porosity, the swelling properties, the mechanical properties, the stiffness, and a lot of pictures of the microstructure. All of that has been recently published in scientific reports. So it's a pretty thick paper with all the in vitro characteristics of the gel. And we feel that this gel is really ready for animal studies, and it's really promising for vocal fold reconstruction. Now we're going to talk about delivery methods. So a lot of the materials that we inject are deliverable through a needle. So we're familiar with microflaps or surgical procedures to remove small lesions, and that may leave a little bit of the void, and then you could fill in the biomaterial by injection with a needle. But looking ahead, in cases where you have a bigger lesion, like a tumor or something like that, then you may need to remove a larger portion of the vocal fold. And then, it's no longer possible to go and inject what's left of the organ. And so one concept is basically to use a 3D printing pen. So many of you might be familiar with 3D printing, which is becoming more and more common for fabrication. And a 3D printing pen essentially is just something that extrudes different products through a nozzle, where you can do layer by layer reconstruction and let the product solidify and rebuild essentially the organ one step at a time. And so you can use this approach to reconstruct the organ if your gelation time permits. So you cannot have something that takes half an hour to solidify, because that would take too long. So you need to have gels that basically solidify faster to do this. So for that, chemical modifications would be important, and I will talk a little bit more about that later. But first, let's talk about physical properties. And I realize that I'm running seriously long. I hope it's okay if I take maybe 5-10 minutes more. In terms of physical properties, all of the soft tissues contain a lot of water. And one experiment that we did in my lab with my former students and Canal, basically you pull on soft tissue in a saline solution and it changes mass. So you pulled on it and waited and then let it relax, waited again. And he did that repeatedly and the mass change was measurable. And it was significant statistically. So I kept sending him back to the lab and saying, you got a mistake and so on. But in fact, this is explainable. So there is a mass change, and we postulated that essentially this was due to water transport through the solid. And there is in the literature some evidence about that. So there's a lot of work being done that show that soft tissue is not incompressible. So for those who do models of the vocal fold, you always assume that the volume of the vocal fold stays constant because liquid is incompressible, and so it doesn't change volumes and vibrates. But that, it turns out, is not really true. So the vocal folds are going to change volume as they vibrate. So what we are doing then is to develop models, mathematical models of pore elasticity that include the influence of chemical potentials to model the transport within the fluid, the transport of fluid within the vocal fold in response to mechanical stressors. And so these are finite element models. And as you can see, if you put the force on a cube of material and you account for the electrochemical potentials and the fluid motions inside the organ, then you get that the volume distribution is not uniform, so you have changes in the density of the material, and you get that the stress-strain behavior is different because you have to account for the motion of the fluid inside. So think about this as when you squish the tomato, the juice flows out, basically. So you have fluid motion and mass change as a result of stress. I'm going to skip over the degradation properties and talk briefly about the chemistry. So one of the challenges is to try to get these hydrogels to stick. So in our lab, another one of my students, Lamina, has done a lot of work, which was recently presented at Cousin by Dr. Karen Cost and collaborator, on essentially how strong the adhesion of the hydrogel is. So what we do is we put X-sized porcelain vocal fold tissue and we fix it onto an aluminum bar, and then we put two of them, one against the other, with the adhesive in between, and we pull and shear, and we measure basically how much force it takes before it breaks. And so we can evaluate the bonding the strength of the adhesives. And so in order to make things bond, oftentimes you can use what's called click chemistry. So one of my students, Sven, is working on this. If you take glycocatazine, which is our gel, and you want to make it gel faster, what you do is you make one batch with tetrazine and another batch with norbornene. And tetrazine and norbornene like each other. And so when you mix these two together after, it just snaps together and binds immediately. And so you can get the gel to bind better and gelify faster using these chemical modifications. I think I won't have time to talk about additional derivatives.